the American Revolution. We all know how it ends, but seriously, if you take a second to really think about it, the whole thing just seems, well, impossible. It's a story that really, on paper, should never have happened. And this is the question, isn't it? It's the big one. How in the world does a scattered group of colonies with no real army or navy go up against the most powerful military on the planet and win? I mean, this is the ultimate David versus Goliath story. When you look at the two sides, it is not even close to a fair fight. And this slide just lays it all out. On one hand, you've got the British Empire. We're talking a global superpower, a professional, full-time army, and a navy that controlled the seas. And on the other, 13 separate colonies, no national army, no navy, and an economy based on farming. So to even begin to understand how this happened, we have to look at the tools each side was working with. So let's start with the superpower, with Goliath. The British Army in the 18th century was an absolute machine, a finely tuned instrument of war. But, and this is key, it was designed and perfected for a very specific kind of fight. And that fight was all about what we call linear tactics. The whole goal was to march onto a wide open field, get your guys packed shoulder to shoulder in these perfect straight lines, and then deliver one massive synchronized blast of fire, the perfect volley, to just shatter the enemy's formation. It was incredibly bloody, but in Europe, man, it worked. Now, what's really fascinating here is who these soldiers actually were. The average British regular, the guy in the red coat, came from the absolute bottom of society. A lot of them were forced into service and signed up for these incredibly long terms. So what kept them in line? It wasn't patriotism. It was brutal, brutal discipline. The fear of 1,000 lashes from their own officers was often way scarier than the enemy in front of them. It was all about obedience. So here's the bottom line. The British had perfected a system for a very specific environment. They were masters of a certain kind of war. But, and this is the huge but, they were about to find out that America was not Europe. It was a whole different ballgame. Okay, so let's flip the script and look at the Americans. Now, they didn't have a professional army, not at all, but they did have their own military tradition. And it wasn't shaped by the fields of Europe, it was shaped by the forests and frontiers of a new world. And the heart of that tradition, the absolute core of it, was the militia. This wasn't an army you joined, it was just something you were. It was this old idea that basically every guy between 16 and 60 had to own a weapon and be ready to fight to defend his town, his community at a moment's notice. And the way they mobilized was completely different. There's no long-term enlistment, no formal process. A threat pops up, the local commander puts out the call, and men from the area just gather. They'd form these temporary units for one specific mission, and then, just as fast as they appeared, they'd melt right back into the population. This quote from a British colonel, this says everything you need to know about Britain's biggest problem. What he's saying is, we're trapped. Their army needed supplies, and the easiest way to get them was by ship. But America was huge, and the deeper you went inland, the worse the roads got. The land itself was fighting against them. And that's because America's greatest strategic strengths weren't its soldiers, but the country itself. There was no single capital city you could capture to end the war, like a London or a Paris. The landscape was perfect for hit-and-run tactics. And maybe most importantly, no matter where the British Army marched, a local militia could rise up out of the ground to fight them. The Americans could always raise another army. So you've got these two totally different military systems, two different ways of thinking about war, and they're on a collision course. And in 1775, they were finally put to the test. And things kicked off fast. In April, you've got the famous skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, where militias swarmed the British all the way back to Boston. In May, they snatched up the critical Fort Ticonderoga without much of a fight. But the first real head-to-head set-piece battle, that would come in June on a hill overlooking Boston. So the British commanders, they're looking up at these American farmers dug in on Breed's Hill, and they just see a rabble in arms. They figured one classic disciplined bayonet charge right up the middle would send these guys running for their lives. It was, to put it mildly, a huge miscalculation. 1,054. Just let that number sink in for a second. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties, that's killed and wounded. It was nearly half of their entire attacking force. For an 18th century army where every trained soldier was incredibly valuable, those losses were absolutely staggering.
Sure, the British took the ground, they won the battle, but it's the textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. The real takeaway here is what both sides learned. The British learned that these Americans would actually fight and that charging straight at them was suicide. And the Americans? They learned that they could stand up to the greatest army in the world and hold their own.
Bunker Hill proved the militia had guts, but you can't win a long-term war with part-time soldiers who go home after every fight. For that, the Americans had to do something even harder: build a professional army from nothing, while they were in the middle of a war.
And so just a few days before the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress took that first massive step. They voted to adopt the ragtag collection of militia units that were camped around Boston. They gave it a new name, the Continental Army, and they picked a Virginian named George Washington to lead it.
But listen to Washington's own words about what he was given: a mixed multitude of people under very little discipline, order, or government. He's basically saying this isn't an army, it's a mob, and his job was to somehow turn this mob into a force that could beat the British.
And this chart here just shows the problem perfectly. Congress, on paper, would vote to create this big army, like 88 battalions in 1776. But the reality on the ground? Washington was lucky if he had 15,000 men who were actually fit to fight. It was a paper army. And it was just in this state of constant, rolling crisis. The individual states hardly ever sent enough men to fill their quotas. The soldiers who did show up only signed on for a year, which meant Washington's army would literally dissolve every single winter. And on top of all that, they were short on everything: muskets, gunpowder, food, even basic clothing and shoes. Which brings us right back to our central puzzle, doesn't it? You have the British Army, this perfect European war machine that was completely the wrong tool for the job. And then you have the American Army, a force that was always just one bad winter or one lost battle away from completely falling apart. So how? How was this war actually won? What was the secret ingredient that finally tipped the scales? That is the question we're going to keep digging into.